standardized against. This is the, whoops, sorry, I clicked that I was okay with the recording and bounced out. So all of the meters of the metric system are measured against this. This is the standard for a meter. There are weight or mass standards that are used for laboratory applications. There's a universal standard for 1 gram, 10 grams, a kilogram, and all other weights are measured against that. And there's even a standard for time. You see in the lower right-hand corner an atomic clock. And this is the standard unit definition of 1 second of time as measured on that clock. And all clocks on the planet are standardized to that. And we need this, right? Without weight standards, grocery stores could charge us anything for any amount of tomatoes, right? We have to all agree on what a pound is so that we're paying a fair amount for a tomato. We have to all agree on what a meter is so that these world records mean something. If we arbitrarily defined a meter as much less, I could break the 100-meter dash record, right? We need a standard definition so we're all operating in the same framework. And we certainly need a standard for time because look at how our lives are governed by time. If we didn't have a universal standardized understanding of the day, then we wouldn't be able to have conferences like this one and have meetings and juggle our schedules. So standards are important. And in fact, they're so important that in the United States, there is a governmental arm to manage standards. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they warehouse and oversee all of these standards so that all of them are being implemented effectively. So again, standards are not a slap on the wrist. They're not meant to be confining or imposing or punitive. They're simply a framework of understanding, a consensus understanding that we can all exist within. And that's really the definition of standard that we mean here for flipped learning. Also, good standards are comprehensive. In other words, they might be wide and complex, but they are all inclusive. What you're looking at here is the standard for the USB connection in computers, the universal standard serial bus. So in order for any peripheral to speak to a computer and a computer to speak to a peripheral, there needs to be a cohesive and comprehensive standard of how information is going to go through that port. Now, I don't know much about computers, so this standard makes no sense to me. All I can see from this is that it's complicated, but I understand that it needs to be complicated because of all that it needs to encompass. And maybe a little closer to home, it's probably reassuring for you all to know that pilots, even private pilots, general aviation pilots, have to adhere to an entire book's worth of standards in order to fly safely in airspace. Again, very complicated, a lot to digest, but it's got to be comprehensive in order to make sure there's safety in the skies. So good standards need to be comprehensive in order to fully capture what it is that they're trying to manage. And we also have a case study of what happens when we don't have standards. So some of you might be old enough to remember the old days where there were actually 2 formats for high definition video on discs. There was Blu-ray, as there is now, but there was also high definition DVDs, HD DVDs. And these were non-standardized formats for digital video. Both of them were high definition discs that you could rent or buy and watch at home, but they were completely different in their standards. So HD DVD players would not play Blu-ray discs, Blu-ray players would not play HD DVD discs. Because of this, movies came out in both formats. And if you received the wrong format as a gift, it was useless to you. So if you got Goodfellas on Blu-ray, you had an HD DVD player at home, you couldn't watch that movie. There was different market share of these formats. Different studios released their movies in one format or another. So if you were both a Sony Pictures fan and a Universal fan, you had to buy both of these players because Universal only put movies out in one and Sony in the other. It's a mess. And the reason it was a mess is because there was no standard, no universal consensus for how the world would watch HD DVDs, high definition digital videos. And perhaps more comical, but very true, 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, NASA lost a $125 million satellite that it sent to Mars. And the reason why they lost this satellite just out there in space, again, a $125 million endeavor, is because the American scientists were using the English system of inches and feet and miles, and the European scientists they were collaborating with were using the metric system, and they never realized the systems they were using. And when they put their work together, the satellite went completely off course. A lack of standards, a lack of a consensus understanding costs this planet not only the scientific understanding of what it could have, but 125 million US dollars. So standards are important, even if they're a little complicated. So again, the argument here is that right now, many flipped learning educators are operating without standards. And in doing so, they're suffering some of the consequences that we've seen with high definition videos and what we've seen with that Mars orbiter. In other words, they're getting a lackluster effect. Things are going wrong in that context. So standards are necessary to address this. Again, I alluded to this in my comments in the intro, but there was a long history of explosive growth in flipped learning. What you're looking at here are the Google search trends of, in blue, the inverted classroom, in red, flipped classroom, in orange, flipped learning, and then in green, total. And you see massive growth from around 2000 until around right before 2020, right before the pandemic. It starts to wane a little bit there, but really strong growth. The prevalence of the terms flipped classroom or hybrid learning in chemical pedagogical papers. So these are teaching and learning papers specifically in chemistry, also growing explosively until recent times. But that interest is waning. We're seeing that increasing demand is actually now decreasing demand. And we attribute that to the lack of satisfaction that I talked about earlier. Students are getting a less than satisfactory experience in the classroom with flipped learning because flipped learning has been so rapidly and so broadly adopted without standards. So we need to address it. It's getting to be the wild, wild west out there. A little bit too much fluidity in how flipped learning is done, and it's costing us, dedicated flipped learners, our reputation in this approach, right? Flipped learning works. We all know it works. We're living the benefits of it working, and we're seeing our students learning better because of it. But as the tide and the consensus sentiment around flipped learning changes, we run the risk of people coming to us with preconceived notions that flipped learning is bad, is ineffectual, and then we have that much more work to do in buy-in. As I joined this conference during the break, I heard you all talking about strategies to communicate to students why we're flipping. We would have to do so much more of that and ask for so much more grace and latitude if they were coming to us already thinking that flipped learning was broken. So we need this framework of standards more now than ever in order to change this tide of decreasing flipped learning efficacy. And that's, again, what the Academy of Active Learning Arts and Sciences has achieved. They've come up with a framework of best practices for flipped learning, and I would argue a framework of best practices for all teaching and learning, flipped or not. And they've divided those into these 12 core areas. So they break down to standards around communication and culture, around professional development, for the individual space, for the group space, a set of standards that is focused exclusively on K-12 education, a set of standards for doing research and providing evidence of effective flipped learning, for learning spaces, for IT needs, for student feedback, for understanding flipped learning ourselves as educators, for planning for flipped learning as educators, and finally for assessment. These 12 core categories is where all of the best practices, all of these standards in the framework fall into. And just as an example for how these standards are important and where they play a role in what we do in the classroom, let's look at these standards through the pandemic lens and see how things have changed for us. So again, here are those 12 standards, and I think communication and culture was never more needed than during the pandemic. Students had a great deal of uncertainty as to how they were going to be educated. Instructors had a great deal of uncertainty as to what our education was going to look like. Are we going to have a classroom? Are we going to be on Zoom exclusively? Are we going to embrace a hybrid approach? And we all understood there was going to be fluidity there as well. Even right now, some of the institutions that I teach for started remote and they're switching to in-person. Some are in person right now and they're worried that they have to go remote. So we need good communication and culture amongst each other and our students to have that trust that's needed in order to educate effectively. The individual space looks much different. Even when students are doing group space activities, sometimes they're in their individual space. So a set of standards for how to maximize efficacy of the individual space is certainly something that was not only needed pre-pandemic, but now as well. I don't even know what the group space is anymore as a flipped instructor. Even when I'm in my group space, the breakout rooms and a Zoom room, the students are still in their dorm room, they're still in their bedroom. So it's kind of a quasi-individual space, group space. Sometimes you have their full attention, sometimes you don't. So we need to really maximize our potential for how to engage students and how to make those active learning strategies work in the group space. And these standards, this framework can help us do that. IT needs have skyrocketed in the pandemic. We need more infrastructure. We need more familiarity with not only Zoom, but the other tools that we're using. So we have standards around that. And even learning spaces are different now. One of the things that flipped learning always relied on was close student interactions in the group space, right? Group work, we were Socratic seminars, students were doing project-based learning. Everything was about tight-knit groups. Well, now they have to do that 6 feet apart in the pandemic. So what does the learning space look like? How do we rekindle the magic of the group space that flipped learning offers, but do it in a pandemic safe way? And we have to keep in mind what's most important about the learning spaces to achieve that. So here they are, right? With all of that set up, hopefully this is a little less daunting than it might look if I were to flash it on the screen at the beginning of the talk. This is what we refer to as the global elements of effective flipped learning, or GFL. All of these boxes that you see, reminiscent of the periodic table of elements, each of these individual elements is a single best practice in flipped learning, a single standard, if you will, that you can embrace to have the highest level of flipped learning satisfaction and efficacy in your classroom. They are color-coded by those 12 categories that I've talked about earlier. So all the way on the left, we see a row for communication and culture. Just next to that in purple are standards for professional development. Group space and individual space make up the bulk of the table, and you can see what the other categories are. So 12 broad categories that we need to address effectively in order to maximize flipped learning in our classroom. But then each of those areas broken down to specific elements or standards that you can embrace in order to make your flipped learning experience that much better for you and your students. So some examples of these specific elements. In the learning spaces, we have flexible spaces, right? To the extent possible, make sure the physical space is flexible so that a variety of different learning strategies or needs can be accommodated. That's a great best practice, right? If we do that, we're going to make the classroom more welcoming to our students and more effective for their learning. In the individual space category, the pre-class has a big idea. Make sure that that big idea that you're trying to convey to the students is clear and explicit in your pre-work that they're doing in the individual space. It's easy for a new flipper to kind of fall into that trap of students will know what they're trying to get out of this, or I've made it so implicitly clear. How could they miss the big take-home message of this? They often do. Those of us who are experienced in this, we realize that there's a time for spoon feeding to the students, especially in the early stages of a typical flipped week. We need to tell them why they're doing it and what we hope they get out of it. A new flipper might not know that, and their class will suffer as a result. So it's a best practice. It's an element in that category. For the group space, establish clear expectations for student responsibilities. Again, all of you that are seasoned, you've learned this the hard way. Oftentimes you'll propose a group space activity, you'll lay it out, you're excited by it, you've got this vision of how well it's going to go, and then crickets, right? They just stare at you with wide eyes and they don't even know how to start. So make those expectations clear. Again, be explicit in what you want the students to do and achieve in the group space. A wonderful thing for a new flipper to be aware of, and something that if they had to learn it on their own on the fly, could lessen the experience of their students. So just some examples of the specific elements that are there in the table. So Errol and I and all of our colleagues at FLGI and at ALAS, we believe that this global elements of effective flipped learning framework is the roadmap to effective, and I have there parenthetically flipped teaching and learning. But again, I argue that any teacher who's not flipping but still embraces these best practices is going to provide a much better experience for their students and a much easier experience for themselves. So what we really want is all flipped instructors, us, the committed ones, but the new ones as well, being the Blu-ray disc, right? Being the standard that advances, the standard that's adopted, being that high quality flipped instructor that's going to change this waning tide and make it clear to students, their parents, future students, graduates, how effective flipped learning is. We don't want anyone to be the HD DVD disc. We don't want anybody to be the flipped instructor left behind in the dustbin, giving that bad reputation to what it is we've worked so hard to achieve. So again, a standard is defined as a level of quality or attainment, an idea or thing used to measure, normalize, or model in comparison evaluations. Well, the thing that we can use to measure against, normalize, and model are these GFUL elements, are these standards for best practices. And if we can do that, that high level of quality and attainment, that's all of us. That's every flipped instructor. And that's the standard that we're trying to meet. So that's our pitch for the GFUL elements. The entire purpose of this was to open this up to a broader conversation and see what you all think of the changing tide of flipped learning, see what you all think about these elements and their potential to perhaps change that tide, and talk a little bit more broadly about the headwinds that flipped learning is facing right now in the midst of this pandemic. So thanks for your attention, and we'll open the floor up here.
Well, thank you very much. Right away, everyone wants to know where they can get the table.
Oh, I'll share my screen. It
was a big hit.
Yeah, I'll share my screen one more time because that link that's on the screen is where you go for the table. So it's www.flglobal.org/elements, and that will be the table right there. I'll put that in the chat as well.
That would be great. Thank you. And we do have a question from Ben. What evidence do you have that flipped instruction is getting a negative impression at this time?
So,
other than your search that you did.
I can't do two things at once. Let me get that in there. So
I'm glad to hear you say that. Me too.
Yeah, so we're seeing waning interest in professional development around flipped learning. So just as the pandemic was striking, and certainly in the early days of the pandemic, inquiries to FLGI had skyrocketed. Lots of institutions were very hungry to have their faculty or their instructors trained on this approach, and that's changed completely. In fact, most institutions are expressing no interest in professional development around flipped learning. And we're hearing anecdotally some reports of some administrative pushback to instructors that want to move in this direction. Student satisfaction seems to be so low that administrations are a little bit more reticent now about going down this road.
I think they don't know what they want to know and want to do, the students.
I think
it's how they're asking them the questions, because we had a survey on our campus, and the way they asked the question, they said, do you want to take face-to-face classes? And so of course they said yes, but then they didn't say, will you attend face-to-face classes?
Yeah.
And so what we found was we moved everything face-to-face, and then students are like, well, where's my remote? Where's my hybrid? Where's my asynchronous? Where's my, so I think it's how they're asking them that may not be a direct measure for the sampling that they're doing. And of course,
I think there are
us to design the survey.
And a lot of instructors out there are labeling themselves as using flipped when they are just adding videos as homework. I don't think there's a full understanding of what flipped learning is. So if I have my students watch videos at home so that they learn even more, and then I give them new information in the classroom and overwhelm them with content, and I call myself a flipped instructor, I've just diminished the brand, right? Because we all know that's not what flipped learning is. But I think there are a lot of individuals labeling themselves as flipped instructors when they don't understand the process, the approach.
Yeah, that sounds like a big problem. Sharon wants to know, can you give more of an explanation of the K through 12 focus family?
Sure. So let me bring up the table once more and share my screen. So I won't put it in slide mode, but you can see that we've got parent support, parent engagement, explain flipped learning to the parents, and provide devices to the students, the learners. So in higher education, we have the luxury of not really needing to interact with parents all that much. It's pretty rare that we'll get a phone call from a parent. But in the K-12 world, there's a lot of need. to convince the parents that this is a good thing for their kids to be doing, to explain to the parents that your children will have to watch videos at home, they'll need a quiet place to do that. And of course, devices are pretty ubiquitous among college students, but not so much in some districts and some lower socioeconomic areas and districts. So these are things that are fairly uniquely K-12 and not really relevant to higher education.
Thank you. How can you explain a good strategy for convincing whoever's in charge of where you teach, for some flipped learning spaces?
You mean how to get a classroom dedicated to flipped learning?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think strategies for better or for worse, strategies that work are not using the term flipped learning, right? So active learning still carries an enormous amount of sway. It's still a positive buzzword for the moment, and flipped learning in the group space is active learning, right? I mean, if we were to distill flipped learning down to what is its real magic, it's that we can do active learning in the classroom, but not sacrifice content delivery. So we've moved content delivery outside of class, and we can do active learning in the class. So if you tell administrations that you want to do active learning, group work, you want to do problem-based learning, Socratic seminar, you want your students being the center of the focus, administrations often get behind that. And then that you're going to implement flipped learning to reach that reality. But I think the term right now has a little bit of excess baggage with it, unfortunately. And your keynote speaker, who will be joining you in about an hour, I believe, an idol of mine, he did a sabbatical not too long ago with an educational furniture manufacturer and designer. And what he has a great deal of information about, and you can ask him about it, I'm sure he'd be happy to share, is how to do very low cost, low lift changes that you can do. So I'll give one example that I learned from him. So this comes from Talbert, but buy some tennis balls, used tennis balls for super cheap. You can usually get them for like $0.10 each. Cut holes on them and stick those on the bottoms of the chairs in your classroom. And now those chairs slide a lot more easily around the room. They don't scrape up the floor. So you've just made your class that much more flexible. You can say to students, scoot over and form groups. And with these tennis balls, it's easier to do. So there are some things we can do that are, we have the power to do without administrative support. And they make a big difference, even though we might not realize it from the outset.
That's wonderful. When we changed buildings, one of the ways we got student buy-in with to have more active learning classrooms was to put all the different chairs, the different types of furniture we were thinking of buying in the library. And we encouraged the students to go and test them and evaluate them and see which ones they would like. And those are whatever was the highest rated ended up in those active learning classrooms. So.
Yeah, they're our consumer, right? Whatever is going to make them learn better is what we should be providing them.
And if they got fussy, I said, students chose these.
That's right.
I did not test them. I did
not
turn
around on them. Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, they're so much better.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we want to thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
No, thanks for the invitation, and good luck on a great conference. And I'll see you all throughout the day.
Great. Thank you very much. And up next is Dr. Benjamin Greenfield, the University of Southern Maine.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, I'm Ben Greenfield. And so the target audience for my talk is both those of us who are advocates, such as everyone who's given talks today, but also those of you in the audience who do not have experience with flipped instruction. Maybe a slightly different philosophical vantage point, if you think about it from the perspective of the individual instructor, as opposed to, the standards for the program of flipped instruction in general. I think that even a very imperfect application of flipped instruction can be highly beneficial for the learning environment, as I'll kind of argue why. And so don't feel like it has to be perfect for it to really, really benefit your students in terms of their learning. And I'll kind of explain the context for that. So a little context for my background is that I was actually one of the members of Chaya's cohort of the iFlip program at SIUE. And then I left SIUE to move to Maine because From what I'm told, Illinois doesn't have enough snow and enough winter weather. So I wanted to go somewhere that had more of that. Those of you in SIU will understand that joke right now in this context. But basically, the school that I'm at has pretty modest class sizes. Most of my classes are not undergraduate classes. And so I think some of the needs in undergraduate flipped instruction are a little different when you have high functioning kind of masters of public health students with a lot of professional background, mid-career with limited time. The students at this campus have very high expectations of the teaching. They're somewhat used to alternative pedagogies. And I also did some work as part of a SEPA grant and an I-test grant and NIH and NSF grants, doing professional development for middle school teachers, where I use the flipped instruction there too. And so I'll touch on that. Most of the teaching I do is in the public health field. And so the real cognitive needs and why flipped teaching is so great is because it's so much opportunity for application and integration within the classroom. And then following that, as opposed to just the lecturing focused on subject matter expertise, as well as a chance to give oversight as students develop specific skills like finding and using information, communication, collaboration, and also in the field, collaboration and pro-social behavior are really important for public health practitioners. And so practicing that in kind of a professional classroom setting. So for those of you who may be on the fence about whether you want to try to flip a class or something like that, this is kind of a key paper that really just shows, I mean, the key thing to realize is that active learning is where it's at. And those of you who are experts know that, and we're all kind of on board, but those of you who aren't, there's been a lot of evidence that if students spend more time in the classroom doing active activities of any kind, it will be very beneficial to their success in learning, particularly in science-based classes. And so we see the evidence of that here in terms of a much decreased failure rate for active learning in both of these graphics. And so that really is where it's at, because when you flip a class, what you're doing by taking the lecture out of the classroom is you're freeing up a lot of time for active learning. So the flipped instruction model, again, this, for people who aren't as familiar with it, is in a basic sense very straightforward. You have the video lectures outside of class. The traditional model has some kind of assessment before class to make sure that they've actually taken in the information. And then the key thing is that in the class, you're doing the collaboration, you're doing, the students are doing the collaboration, or you're answering questions based on their active participation. And that's really where it's at. So my personal goals for my classes include the following. I really want to create classroom environments that are very positive and pro-social. So this includes student ownership of their own learning, not through testing, but through their own kind of, wanting to be part of it. A casual and low stress atmosphere that's inclusive to different types of learning styles. Collaborative and pro-social, meaning helping each other, sharing information and sharing ways of knowing. Everyone in the class gaining value and having a fun and social environment. So we kind of, my guru here is kind of Homer Simpson doing some meditation basically in my class, positive, chill experience. So the flipped model, right here, the basic model, what I'm going to do now is show some of the modifications that I do to the basic model, right? So in my class, actually, I don't really modify the before class activity. The students are gaining exposure to the material through videos, multiple short videos posted on a learning management system. I kind of refer back to Anne-Marie's talk and Thomas's talks earlier, that having the videos organized well in the learning management system, I think is really helpful, so they can find them all in one place. So in terms of the pre-class assessment, this is where I deviate, given the fact that I have mature adult learners. I don't emphasize that as much. So you could say that maybe my flipped teaching doesn't follow the strict flipped instruction model. Sometimes I'll have a few video quiz questions. Sometimes I will actually just check the students' lecture notes to make sure that they took notes on the whole video. And sometimes I won't have a pre-class assignment. And that's because I kind of trust the students to own their own learning. I want them to know that I trust them. And I don't want to have a lot of kind of little Quizlets and things like that. And I think that this is appropriate when you're talking about high functioning graduate level students. Where it's really at, for me in the flipped instruction, is the student collaboration with each other. Informal group work, application and integration applying to specific case studies, this being inclusive, for different types of learning styles, collaborative and pro-social, and enabling everyone to kind of gain value from the engagement. And with this kind of more casual kind of group work environment, having a kind of more fun and social experience. So I do, instead of kind of the pre-class thing, I emphasize a lot a weekly assignment based on that class material after the class. And this material is then re-emphasized in culminating activities such as a synthesis problem set later in the semester. Kind of, this would be at the time that you have a midterm or a final exam. They get a large kind of like a take-home midterm, which I call a problem set. And so the kind of after class activities achieves the goal of them keeping up with the material on a weekly basis. And the weekly assignment based on what's happening in the class is really helping with the application, integration, and skill development, and the absence of exams. And I think this kind of, like all flipped instruction, I think it is less stressful because there's kind of frequent assessment activities, and that's kind of built into the flipped model. So to summarize kind of my conceptual paradigm in a different way, each week is like a mini course, basically, with application and assessment of new content on a specific topic. I'll give some examples a little later in the talk. They are case studies, and so they incorporate the ideas of problem-based learning and team-based learning. And I really try to choose activities that are robust to different learning styles and preparation levels. So sometimes these are more exploratory, student-led activities where they can come up with different types of questions and strategies based on what interests them at the time. And so now I'm kind of going to go into two examples. So my first example is in my environmental health course. This is a master's level class, although I've taught it at the undergraduate level. And it focuses on integrating spatial analysis and environmental justice in terms of evaluating environmental issues. So the video lectures focus on geospatial data, that is the types of data and how you interpret and understand spatial patterns, and environmental justice, that is the issue of trying to maintain equitable distribution of environmental benefits across vulnerable groups. So that's kind of what's in the video lectures. The in-class group work begins with a quiz game, and this is very brief. It's basically posted quiz questions that then the groups actually try to come up with answers and see who can answer it first. And then most of the class is focused on exploring a mapping tool called EJ Screen. It's an EPA tool publicly available. I'll show graphics of it later, but it's really good for exploring spatial patterns of environmental justice. And then the after-class assignment builds upon that, where they explore the tool further on their own, and then they answer a set of 8 questions that I asked, kind of long form answer questions based on the results of their exploration to kind of synthesize and bring out some of the main points. So here is an example of the tool. You can see at the top that we have on the left map traffic volume, with the bright red being higher traffic volume, and on the right map poverty levels, with the darker colors being higher rates of poverty. And so this would be one of the types of explorations that they might do with the tool. These side-by-side mapping are part of the tool. And then I'll have them explore questions such as, these are questions that they have them answer. What's the scale of the data available? So thinking about this geographic aspect of these little polygons are the smallest scale that you can look at the data. And so a key part of geography is understanding that you can't look at patterns at smaller scales than you have the data for. Is there an environmental justice concern? And so seeing, kind of using spatial and visual inspection to see higher traffic areas have higher rates of poverty. So this suggests, yes, there is an environmental justice concern where people in more vulnerable subpopulations are basically facing more environmental risks. And then the strengths and limitations of the tool, this being a way to think about kind of the limitations of spatial analysis in general. So that kind of being a first example. Now we move on to another example, and this one was part of the kind of funded research. This is actually a middle school teacher professional development workshop, although I use similar methods in my other classes. And we're going to look at data visualization of air pollution data in this example. So before the class, the video lectures focus on air pollution from particulate matter, the sources, health effects, and regulation. The group work begins with a PowerPoint style quiz. So you can see here, like I'll post a slide like this and have them try to fill in the boxes with answers of the attributes of this being a graphic of fine particulate matter air pollution. And then again, spending most of the time exploring a set of web air pollution mapping and plotting tools with some targeted questions. After class, they are then provided with themselves with a low-cost air pollution monitor funded through the I-TEST and SEPA and NIH and NSF programs that they can then use in their own schools. So here's an example of one of the mapping tools that we use. So each of these points is made available from a low-cost sensor. These are called purple air monitors. And so they would look at this general map and start out at the broad scale and look at patterns of where particulate matter pollution is highest and why. So Southern California, there's the fires, as well as some geographic features and lots of cars that increase the air pollution in these areas. Then they have the opportunity to explore on their own, look at different scales. And so when we did this program in the Metro East St. Louis area, we looked at all of the sensors, many of which were set up by these actual teachers over time of the spatial patterns there. And then they can look at, when you choose particular sensors, you can look at the mapping of the graphical patterns and ask how much pollution is changing over time, how is it changing over time, and why may it be changing over time, looking at things like traffic or day versus night, weekday versus weekend, and then really prompting them to explore how they would use these tools in their own teaching. So using the discussion time for them to think about the types of pedagogy exercises that they would use. So to summarize, I kind of describe here what I use flipped instruction mostly for mature adult learners, making some modifications, especially de-emphasizing the pre-class assignments and really focusing in the class time on group work, active and collaborative learning, and sometimes open-ended student-led exercises focused on integration and application, on case studies, such as the ones that I've shown, visual exploration of data, as well as other kind of cognitive methods, trying to have like the inclusive classroom environment with group work, with the social benefits of the social learning. So with that, I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. Usha had a question. She liked the idea of each week a mini course, but how do you bring all the mini courses together at the end of the semester?
I bring them, that's a great question. I bring them together through, let me show you this step here. Through the culminating activity. So these synthesis problem sets, you can think of them as like exams, and they're going to review the various topics that we've covered over the semester through problems that the students solve. I should also add that I have 2 of them in the semester, in mid-semester and end semester, and each of those weeks we focus entirely on reviewing the content and reviewing those problem sets to review all of those things.
So that, thank you. So that last thing that you showed with the EJ screen, and when you showed that, yeah, when St. Louis, would they be doing this at home and then they would be bringing in their data? Oh, yeah.
So let me focus on this example for that, because this is more of a traditional classroom. So pre-class, they review the lecture content. During class, they start playing with the tool and get familiar with it, with my supervision on how to use the tool. After class, they are instructed to continue using the tool to come up with their own examples and answer some of these types of questions. So it really emphasizes the after class kind of integration of the activities.
That's cool. And do they work individually or in a group for that?
I typically,
During
class is always group work. After class is always individual, so they establish their own competence.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thanks a lot. I'll look at all the chat comments now. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, great. Okay, next up, we have Dr. Naftali Marina Gonzalez.
Yes, hello. Hi, so I'll just share my screen now.
Yes, please.
Okay, there we go. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, and especially thanks to Chaya for organizing such an amazing event. It's really nice to see all like-minded individuals, and I'm really glad to see all the progress that's been made in the field, and it's just really encouraging. I'm just here to present you a little story of success. So a little background. So I work in UCL in London, So basically started working with flipped learning probably 5 years ago. So at the beginning, we were doing very, I was working in a program that was very small. It was just new. There was very few students, and everything was based on flipped learning in small group tutorials. But then the program became very popular. It started to increase the student numbers. We went from 30 to 100 in just 1 year. So it was really difficult, unsustainable to keep doing this kind of small group teaching. So this is why I started to play around and implementing this flipped learning method, which is like a large scale flipped learning method called peer instruction. And it worked really well for us for a number of years. But then the story I'm going to tell you is actually a different story that came after my story. So I met some colleagues from Spain, from the University of La Laguna in Tenerife. And they approached me because when they saw some of my case stories I published about peer instruction, they were really desperate because they had a really big problem in Spain with low class attendance, absenteeism. For some reason, in Spanish universities, apparently they don't make mandatory class attendance. So the students obviously were not very engaged, and the class attendance was very poor. And this is in the clinical in clinical medicine, on clinical undergraduate medicine. So this was really driving them to despair. It was really frustrating for both students and for teachers as well. These really low levels of attendance. So the whole atmosphere was really frustrating. So this is why they approached me, because I said, well, we want to do something. We need to change what we're doing, and probably doing flipped learning is going to help. And my first reaction was like, well, how big is your cohort? Approximately 150 students. So my first reaction was like, yeah, definitely flipped learning is going to help. But you're going to encounter the same problems we have. If you do a traditional flipped learning, which is small group tutorials, you're going to need a really big amount of faculty to deliver the sessions. And once again, you're going to end up with a lot of problems. So we started working, and I proposed the idea of doing peer instruction. And it turned out to be one of the most productive collaborations I've had, at least from the educational research perspective I've had in recent years. So this is Manuel, this is Enrique. These are professors of gastroenterology from University of La Laguna, beautiful Tenerife. They're probably really warm at the moment, which is really nice. But and this is the method I was telling you about. It was created by Eric Masur in Harvard a few years ago. And as you can see, it's a method that basically you can do a really large scale flipped learning approach in auditoriums of 300 students or whatever. So the number is not a limitation. And if anything, it makes it even more vivid. So how does it work? Well, I'll tell you exactly how it works. I'll tell you exactly what we did. So basically, we did a prospective control, non-randomized study in which we used their module, their course. We basically flipped it, and we looked at the results. So this was a product of, as you can see, 3 academic years. The first year, the good thing about this module, this course, is that it's combined. It has 2 elements: the medical component and the surgical component, which are assessed separately, and they reach a final score. In 2016, they were delivered with a traditional, lecture-based system. In 2017, we only. This is the most important observation we did. One of the components, the medical component, was flipped, and we did the whole medical component into peer instruction. The surgical component stayed the same in 2017. And finally, given the success in 2018, both components were finally flipped. The structure is, like as you all know, we provided the students with video lectures with embedded quizzes. So the staff in ULL made a huge effort in the summer to basically create all this content, provide supplementary material, etc., etc. And the students needed to come prepared for the session. And then finally, they were exposed to the peer instruction method. So what exactly is peer instruction? So finally, what is peer instruction? Well, the session is actually divided in rounds of peer instruction. Each round lasts approximately 10-15 minutes. It starts by just giving a very brief presentation, no more than 5 minutes, just to recapitulate the topic. And then the students are presented with what is called a concept test. It's just basically a multiple choice question, which basically exposes common difficulties in the understanding of the material. I'll show you some examples a little bit later of what a concept test is. It's just an MCQ, like I said. And then the students are allowed to think for 2 minutes and vote. And this is an important thing. So if less than 30% of the students choose the correct answer, then you need to go back and revisit the concept, once again, give a little explanation and present the question again. If 70% of the students answer the correct, pick the correct answer, then basically then that's pretty much the end. So the teacher just basically has to give an explanation and then just move on to the next topic. But this is the important thing. So which normally happens between 30 and 70%, which is kind of like a low percentage of students selecting the correct answer. So that means that when you allow the students to do a peer discussion, you tell them, turn to your neighbor and then just discuss the topic and try to convince each other about your answers, and then you allow them to vote again. And this is the value of peer instruction. When one student basically who understands the concepts at a really kind of like basic level, and then transmits this information to another student, and that's where the most learning occurs, when one student is teaching another, and they're basically pretty much at the same academic level. So this is probably why peer instruction is so effective. Now, the data we gathered throughout the years can show you. So once again, as you can see, there's 2 cycles of asking the same question, one before the discussion with their peers and another one after the discussion with their classmates. And as you can see immediately in each round of peer instruction, the percentage of correct answers is significantly increased after this round of peer instruction, after the students can discuss the concept with their classmates. Every question, there's a significant increase in the percentage of correct answers. So their concept test performance increases. And obviously this was reflected in the final exam scores. For the medical component, for example, that if you remember, it was flipped in 2017. Using peer instruction significantly increased the probability of students getting higher grades. So they divide in Spain. There's the system of grades A, B, C, and D. A and B are the highest scores, D would be the lowest ones. And as you can see, between 2016, which was a traditional lecture style, and in 2017, when they implemented peer instruction, there was a significant increase in the percentage of of students achieving high grades. And conversely, this is really interesting, the number of students achieving low scores actually decreased with peer instruction. So it was definitely something unexpected, but a very, very welcome result. The surgical component, which was left intact, actually, as you can see, nothing happened between 2016 and 2017 because it was exactly delivered using the traditional lecture system. So obviously there was absolutely no change. So this was the really big surprise that they were really pleased to see. But this is the most important, I think, the most important result they obtained. As you can see, in 2016, this is the attendance that they were getting before the implementation of peer instruction. So during traditional lectures. So at the beginning of the course, so pretty much 70–80% of the students were attending the class, and this progressively dropped until at the end of the course it was, as you can see, the attendance was really low. Less than 20% of the students were attending. So in 2017, when peer instruction was implemented, you can see that once again, now here we're comparing obviously the surgical component, which basically stayed the same with traditional lectures, you can see the same trend happen. So the attendance was dropping and dropping and dropping until it became really, really abysmal. But in the component, in the medical component, which was delivered with peer instruction, the attendance was pretty good throughout the duration of the course, and it was sustained for the whole duration. So that was where I think it was the biggest element of success. And then finally, the following year, they decided to flip the other component, the surgery component, and then, as you can see, a lot of students basically were spreading the word, and it became really successful. And the attendance was pretty much very close to 100% throughout the semester. So that was probably the biggest story of success. And then other people started to hear about it. Other course leaders started to hear, and they started to flip their courses as well. So this is a 4-year course in undergraduate medicine, gastroenterology once again, and all the other clinical courses at this point. Last thing I heard, for the 4th year in the medical undergraduate program in La Laguna are pretty much flipped using peer instruction. So I think it was really successful. This is the kind of questions that I was telling you about. I only have 1 minute. The questions are basically these kind of questions that I like to, the way I explain them is that is a questions that you really need a lot of information, basic information. But if you see this kind of questions and you try to Google it, for example, you wouldn't find the answer in Google, definitely. You really need to make associations. You really need to take all this background information you have in your head and really try to dig in to find the answer. So they're not simple questions, but definitely not something you will find just by doing a Google search. Now, what makes a good question? Well, the questions should not test factual knowledge. This is the most important thing. They should enable active learning of core concepts. So basically, application of core concepts that allow students to basically dig in and try to identify the mechanisms by really exploring and discussing between each other. The questions shouldn't be really difficult, but they shouldn't be really hard. If they're really hard, then you're going to see that you have to keep repeating. You do a peer instruction round, and then you have to keep explaining because the students are not going to be able to proceed. And if it's too easy, you're going to see that more than 70% of the students will get the correct answer from the very beginning. So that means that question is not going to be good. So that's why the question should be hard enough that even if you know the factual knowledge, you still need to work it out. So once again, it's not something you can find in Google. And definitely this is something that takes practice. Writing this kind of questions is difficult, it's challenging, but once it's done, the results are absolutely impressive. And I can tell you that our colleagues in Spain are really happy now because they pretty much solved all the big issues that they have for many years. So that's all I needed to say for now. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll probably take a few questions. And thank you very much for your attention. And really, thank you very much for inviting me to this amazing event. I think it's been a really enjoyable day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very fantastic results.
Yeah.
And it was nice that you were here because some of the questions people were asking earlier, how do you get them to come? How do you get them to do it? How do you get them to buy it?
Yeah, exactly.
You did it.
Yeah, yeah,
Fantastic.
That's true. I mean, how do you get the students to buy it in? It was funny because when we did the study in 2017, the same students were the actual control. That was what really gave a lot of power to this study. So the same cohort, the same students were the same control, and they were just comparing their experience in the same module with the same teachers, but just basically looking at different components. One being taught completely with the traditional method, and one with peer instruction. So the students were the ones that they saw, they immediately at the end of the module, they said, why can't we have more teaching like this? Because they immediately saw the benefit. And then another thing that was really funny is our colleagues were telling me that the teachers were passing by, other teachers from other courses, and then they saw that the classroom was absolutely full. and they just went to ask, what are you guys doing? Because our classrooms are completely empty. What are you guys doing? Are you giving them money, or what is happening here? And they were like, well, no, actually, we're doing this thing called preinstruction. So they invited me to come to Tenerife to give a workshop to all the clinical medical staff and to inspire them to basically to adopt and adapt the system as well. Yeah, it became really popular, and pretty much everybody is doing it now. So yeah, very, very effective method. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Nothing
Thank you.
brings success like more success, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Kim Granger from St. Louis Community College. And after she completes her talk, we will have a 15-minute break before our keynote.
I'm unable to share the screen. It says that share while someone else is sharing.
Yes, okay, there we go.
Okay, thank you.
No
Let me
problem.
see if this will work. Okay. Oh. Is the screen shared?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to share just a real simple piece to flipping, because as I've talked with colleagues here at St. Louis Community College and elsewhere, it seems that one of the fears of flipping seems to be how to manage that class time, creating those active learning activities. That seems to worry some faculty with trying to start flipping. And so that's what I wanted to share today. I found through the work I was able to do with the iFlip grant, I was able to hone in on this process of creating some activities that then became very, very easy to recreate, to revise, and then even make for other courses as well. So my flipped experience is that I've fully flipped a calculus course, which was officially the part to the iFlip grant. But in addition to that, I've also flipped a quantitative reasoning course. That's our college level math course for a non-STEM major who isn't going to need calculus. And the way that the courses run, my flipped courses run, is there's a pre-class assignment that could be graded, guided reading notes, and also videos. Those guided reading notes are easy to grade. It's just a completion grade. But then for the video, there's a short quiz over the video in the next class session. It often includes a little bonus if you can describe the guest character, because I was using a document camera to make those earlier videos. And my kids had all these little, I don't know if your family has these little Lego guy characters. You've got Mickey Mouse, you've got Minnie Mouse, you've got Batman, every character you can imagine. And so for fun, I started putting one of those characters in the video. And for whatever reason, that seemed to be what some of the students gravitated to, was simply, they knew they'd get a bonus point on that quiz if they could name the character. And some of them maybe didn't know who it was, but they described it, just verifying that they had seen that video. But the majority of class time is then able to be used for the class activity, which is really why I wanted to flip. I know that active learning, collaborative learning is the best way for students to learn. The only way we could seem to achieve that, to be able to use that class time for active learning, is if we do put the lecture content outside of class. And so collaboration, I think all of us would agree, especially those of us who are here, is really the best way for students to learn. But a big aha moment I had was that not every activity had to be collaborative. And especially during the COVID time when everything went virtual, although that collaborating part became really the challenge for me, getting students to collaborate when you were putting them in these small group rooms and then expecting them to work together is sometimes a struggle, but we can still do active learning, even if every activity, even if everyone isn't collaborative. Some of the activities are simply active activities where the students are working out problems even if it's somewhat independent. The goal is always to get as much collaboration as possible, but I've conceded to if I can even get them active, because there really are some students who are so uncomfortable with collaborating that I don't tend to push that as much for every activity. There are some activities that I really push the collaborating, but not all of them. Here's this as easy as 1, 2, 3 that I found to create a learning activity that could be active, simply active, or in some cases active and collaborative. I started making these activities because I was rolling this out for a full flip for more than one class. To start with, providing the clear directions. And then here's a big key is I put on the sheet, the paper, the set of problems that students are working together or independently, but working in class. I put the possible answers. And what that does is it then allows students to self-check whether they're on the right track or not. And then just to hold students accountable, I do have an answer page that will be collected and graded. Sometimes I don't do that every time, but sometimes there's an answer page that's collected and graded. So I wanted to just go through these 3 pieces a little more thoroughly. The clear directions, how is it going to be graded? How is that activity, that class activity, going to be graded? What should the group be doing? That was even more important during the virtual times, because when the students were in breakout rooms virtually, I didn't have eyes and ears in their rooms all the time. So it was hard to tell if a particular group was completely lost at what to do. So I found if I printed those directions very thoroughly, then it was easier for everyone to stay on task. For example, each group member will write out the work for each problem on their own paper, but then work collaboratively. Because if I didn't do that, there were some students who weren't actually being active. They were active listeners, listening to what the other group members were doing, but not actually doing the math themselves. And then being really clear on what to turn in. Here's an example of that possible answer box. There's a number of calculus problems written out, and then there's this box of all the potential answers. Now, it is true that some of these answers, even if you didn't know calculus, you could just match up. Well, there's only a few questions that have a letter A in them, so you could do a little guess and check and figure that out. But the goal really wasn't, it's not like it's a test. The goal of this answer key is to give the students that self-efficacy, because when they start doing a couple of problems, I'm like, yeah, I'm getting this right, I can do this. They tended to work harder and even do a little bit better. So that box of possible answers helps students continue to work while I'm walking around with helping other students, because of course I'm not one-on-one with every group or with every student all the time. And it gives them the confidence that they're on the right track. And then that answer page, this answer page, when they know, I don't know if your students are like this or not, at graduate level, undergraduate level, college level math, or developmental level math, it seems like this one thing holds true for all students is when it's not graded, we seem to relax a little bit more. So by having something that's holding them accountable for completing that work, it does seem to promote a better work ethic. And another piece is that answer page that they're writing out their answers on can be checked really easily by me and by the embedded tutor as we're walking around the classroom. Here's a sample activity. I know it's quite small and you can't see this fully, but hopefully you can get the general idea. At the top, we've got the directions, and then I added a little bit of like on this activity, I don't know if you can see this activity to the left here. You can see a little bit of content being, students being reminded. And then we've got there's 14 practice problems for students to do, and then the answers are at the bottom. If you have been not fully jumped into the full flipped because you think, oh, it's just too much work. I'll say that by coming down to this way of presenting these practice problems has shortened the amount of work that it takes to get a really good activity. So almost every activity now that I do looks like this. And now I can focus more of my time on those videos. I can focus more of my time really interacting with students and not spending so much time creating these elaborate, wonderful activities. A few last things that I've found when I'm really wanting students to engage with each other. I don't know if this holds in your classes, but there's something magical about the word quiz. So from time to time, I'll shift everything. And I do this strategically as a class has gotten too comfortable and maybe fewer students are really engaging. If I want to increase the engagement just like that, I'll say, oh, I've got a great opportunity for you. We're going to count this next activity as a quiz so it can boost your grade. But there's something about that word quiz that all of a sudden students are working a lot harder. Another thing I'll show you is this: when I wanted students to be collaborating more, I did a half and half answer sheet. So what happened is students are going to turn in their work, but on an answer sheet, but I gave every other student an answer sheet for half of the problems, and every other student had the answer sheet for the other half. So they couldn't possibly get away with working independently fully. They had to, at some point, coordinate with each other. Sometimes I threw in a little humor, just like I did with the quiz, of great opportunity, because of course they're not going to see a quiz as a fun thing, right? But that half answer sheet, I'd add a little humor in and say, oh, the copier just went crazy. I don't know what happened. It only gave half of the answers on each side. So why don't we just go ahead and do this? When it happens the second time, they were like, oh yeah, that wasn't a mistake. She did that on purpose. But it's what a purposeful way to get students, forcing students to have to interact, right? And then another tip for creating engagement: when the students know there's going to be a post-activity assessment, and sometimes that assessment could be with the group or it could be independent, but they're going to be a little more focused, or what I've found is that students are a little more focused when they're doing that. The last tip I have for engagement that I've discovered, and this is one I discovered early on in my teaching career, is this idea that students need to have some time to get to know each other first. So I will often ask them at the start of their time that they're working with their group to write down the name and something interesting about each of their group members. And randomly throughout the course, there'll be an opportunity on a test or a quiz. Write down the name and an interesting fact about someone in our class. And if they can recall some of those facts. So if they're doing that every day and they're getting that interesting fact every day, then they're getting to know each other a little bit better, but then they're kind of remembering those things about each other too. I started doing that early on because one of the times when I was first doing some group work, I had a student who was very vocal, said, "What are you making us work together? And we don't even know each other's names." And I realized, oh, he's really onto something. I hadn't thought about how important it was that if they were going to be comfortable doing math together, that they really needed to be comfortable knowing each other first. But here's a little snippet of that half answer sheet. On the left, you see the questions, but then you'll see that the even numbered answers are on one sheet, except for the number one. The number one was on both sheets, and then the odd number questions were on the other sheet. Well, that's all I had. I don't know if we have any time for questions or not. It looks like it might be time for the break. We started, but I hope that you found some of these a little bit helpful.
If we can have a quick answer on how you would do this same type of activity for open-ended questions. Do you ever ask those in your math class? Kelly wanted to know.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's sometimes, and of course, that's not where there'd be a place for an answer box, but I'll often say, explain why, or describe the process in your own words. And the way I really get students to engage there is saying, oh, these are great test questions. So edging them on to, if you want to do well on the test, you need to focus on some of this why and how and explain. But those ones, of course, they don't fit into the answer box as much, but it's a great way for students to be engaging and discussing that.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And I want to let everyone know we are going to have a 15-minute break and come back at noon and for our keynote.
Some of us will be here if anyone wants to chat with us. Stay long, otherwise if you need a break, don't leave, come back. We have an exciting talk to attend.
Great session, Shaya.
Oh, well, you presented, so it had to be great.
I had some caffeine today. Sarah, I really enjoyed your talk. It was very, I like the precision of how you went through those examples. I mean, I liked every talk, so.
Every single one was amazing. Yeah, a great data, Sarah. You have collected so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was all from the survey data that you had. It was just pulling out, you know, different things related to the chemistry courses. And I think we all know just by thinking about it, of course, the asynchronous courses, students are going to be less engaged,
Right.
less willing to buy into those types of activities because we have enough challenge convincing them that they should come to class prepared. But seeing like such a pronounced difference between students, especially the engineering students, being really excited about the flipped learning to really kind of being turned off when they were in the asynchronous format just really emphasized that difference.
I think it was the asynchronous, but I think part of it also is it was a very demoralizing time for people in general, you know, when that was going on. It was just like, you know,
True.
it was hard to be happy and positive.
Yeah, well, and that's why I said for me, this past fall, I had an organic class and it was all in person. And most of the students had been, for their general chemistry, completely online asynchronous. And it was one of the most engaged classes I think I've ever had because they were so excited to be in the classroom. Like they worked in groups, they like 95% of them watched the videos in advance. They asked tons of questions. And you know, at first I thought with social distancing, maybe they wouldn't want to, but they jumped right into it and they were really excited. And their comments on the survey, I haven't looked at the numbers, but like the general comments that they submitted were really positive. So we'll see. I mean, they were students who had never had an in-person science class because they asked me the first few weeks, like, oh, should we bring our textbook to class? And I was like, no, I never expect you to bring, you know, the huge chemistry textbook to class. But they didn't know because they hadn't been in college, you know, in person for a year and a half.
Right. Yeah, Neff, I enjoyed your talk. A great study design. I don't know how you were able to do that. You're muted, Neff. You're still muted. Neff, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, definitely. It was a really long process. It took basically 3 years, very painful collecting data and going through many journals as well to try to publish the story. But I think in the end, the data speaks for itself, and it was just very successful. To be honest, it's one of the most productive collaborations I've ever had because and to see the response of all the faculty in Spain as well, how they responded and how they were really excited about the results. Yeah, it was amazing. And to be honest, the success was so much higher in Spain than what we got in London was okay, because we went from a flipped learning kind of small group tutorial to peer instruction. So I didn't really publish the data I obtained because it was a bit a bit boring, to be honest, because nothing really happened. So the students were very happy as well, but the scores didn't really change, which was good. So basically, the main story of success there was that we were able to do flipped learning at a large scale,
Yes,
without having to use so many human resources, obviously. So that was really good. But the effect they obtained in Spain was absolutely abysmal. It was incredible. Yeah, I was really impressed.
Sarah teach large classes here, and you know, the biggest concern is how do we do flipped teaching in a large classroom? You know, I have been asked many times, and your study speaks volumes.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that's the thing. To be honest, this is how I found it. I was just trying to see what was the answer to that, and that's how I found preinstruction. I started to read all of Masur's guides and papers, and I realized it's not as difficult at first until you start preparing the questions. That's when that part is really difficult, I have to say, very difficult. But then everything came to place, and yeah, incredible. So I was really pleased. And in Spain, it's like a thing. It became very fashionable, and now everybody's doing it. So yeah, it was really good.
Very nice.
I looked it up because I wasn't sure it was a word, but the way I design my exams, but it is ungoogleable or non-googleable. It's a word. Those are words now. And that's exactly what you're doing.
I'm sure they are.
And that's important because it makes them really think. They're not memorizing it, you know.
Exactly. And that's the thing with new generations. They're just used to just having the answer on their phones in the blink of an eye immediately. And this really makes them work and really makes them really think very carefully. And the most important thing, at least with this technique, is that it completely defeats. There's something they call the curse of learning or the curse of teaching, which basically the teacher is just basically explaining concepts at a really high level, and that's why the students sometimes they can't understand because it's very high. So when a student is explaining the concepts to another student, they're basically at the same level, and they explain the things in a very simplistic, in a very basic way. And that's why the other student who doesn't understand at first immediately can understand a lot easier than if a professor is explaining the concept, because you have these two elements of operating at the same level. It's really powerful, and I saw it happening all the time. You just see the students say, "Oh, yeah, now I understand." So it's quite powerful. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Never underestimate the power of students teaching each other. It's really good.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Usha Shankar. I teach human physiology at Fordham University in New York City. I really love the presentations. This is phenomenal. Thank you for organizing, and thank you to all the speakers. I just had a quick question to Kim Granger. She talked about I'm just raising this question because I thought it might be useful to other people as well. She talked about some kind of a fellowship or some grant or something that helped her implement the flipping. Is that something someone can talk about?
This is our NSF-IU's grant. It was awarded to train faculty to use flipped teaching in their classrooms. It was specifically for STEM faculty, and Kim was one of the participants.
Okay, so is that still available? Is that still for people?
What it was for was two institutions. One was a 4-year and one was a 2-year institution, and we had 24 faculty participate in it. We are in the 4th year of this grant. It's the tail end of it. Now, basically the presentations you heard and saw were all from this grant. They were able to implement, collect data, and put it together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Shaya, can I ask a question, please?
Of course, of course.
We are actually, one of the projects I mentioned earlier in my talk is to introduce flexible learning in computer science courses and programs.
Yes.
So we are going to deliver the same course in different format, and we give the students the chance to select whatever modality they would like to share in. I mean, you can attend the lecture face-to-face or through Zoom, or watch it streamed through any media, and he can choose, select some time to do this, some time to do this, flexible learning, you know.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
and then we were thinking of, at the same time, using the flipped classroom methodology. We are worried, to be honest, that might complicate things for us. Any ideas?
Well, flipped teaching is where, you know, they are doing this preparation on their own using different modalities. Then they ultimately will come together and share their learning with others, and then learn from each other. Right? So yes. So we need to be flexible in their engagement with the content.
Okay. I mean, if, for example, if I give examples, if I opt to prepare for a classroom with a lecture, to flip the lecture, send them the lecture or the series of videos,
Correct.
and then they would come face to face and attend the lecture, in which they, you know, they actually do some activities.
Correct.
But the same material will be delivered as a Zoom session.
Correct. We are currently doing it here in our institution. Some students do not want to be in the classroom. They want to be attending through Zoom. So I will be in class in person, but students are joining remotely. And then some are doing a group work remotely, some are doing it in person. So it is very flexible right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then
yeah.
we will be in touch
Yes, it is.
To copy the experience.
We call it high flex, where you have several modalities all at the same time going on.
Okay, good. Excellent. Thank you.
Right.
Hey, everybody. I don't have any questions or anything. I just want to make sure my mic works.
Hello.
Looking good? Okay.
Hello, Professor Chair.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Torre.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine. So I got just a question. Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for the nice talks. Actually, I enjoyed them much.
Very good.
Actually, I got experience with flipped class. Okay, where I used the team-based approach in class activity, and actually it was nice and it worked well. My question is that, are there any experiences using other methods other than team-based approach in class activity in teaching basic and medical clinical sciences?
You can use case-based or problem-based learning. Those are widely used in the medical schools to teach medical sciences.
But where does
but my experience with the case-based and with the problem-based, usually they are used as standalone, not as a part of flipped class. But okay, this is so. I think this is a nice experience, so we will try it, inshallah.
Yeah, we will talk again, Tariq, outside.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. We're gonna have Robert's gonna get ready to share a slide, and while he's doing that, I could say that I flipped just specific content, and so with the time that we have in class, we've done dramatizations, we've sung songs about physiology, you know, different types of things where they're actually up and physically walking around, and that worked really well.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
And that was medical school and undergraduate.
Okay, thank you.
Is it time?
Yes,
it
go
is
ahead,
time.
Chaya, take it away.
All right. Well, I am very excited to introduce a great keynote speaker with a background as an innovative educator. And he's going to offer actionable ideas about flipped learning, especially now when we are getting out of this pandemic, hopefully. Dr. Robert Talbot is a professor and a department chair of mathematics at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. His primary research interests are the scholarship of teaching and learning, focusing on flipped learning, alternative grading practices, and teaching with technology. I need to record, it is recording. He's the author of Flipped Teaching, a guide for higher education faculty, published by Stylus in 2017. And he's a frequent workshop facilitator and a keynote speaker on teaching and learning in the United States and abroad. His recent article titled "Flipped Learning Can Be a Key to Transforming Teaching and Learning Post-Pandemic" gives a huge push to reshape higher education. Dr. Talbot spent a sabbatical year as a scholar in residence with the Steelcase Education, where he conducted research and outreach on active learning and active learning spaces. He was recently named a Presidential Fellow for the Advancement of Learning at Grand Valley State University, where he works to expand innovative, high-impact teaching and learning practices across the university. Dr. Talbot regularly writes about math, technology, education, and academic productivity at his website, rtalbot.org. So please put your hands together for a warm welcome to Dr. Talbot.
Hey, everybody, I can see your hands going together, although I'm glad that you're muted so I can't hear them. So thank you for being here. Let me get my screen going here. It's great to be with you this morning. It's an honor to speak with you, and I'm really grateful for several things as we get started. First, the invitation to speak with you today and the work that Shaya and all of her team has put in to make the symposium happen. Secondly, I'm grateful that this is being done online, because as great as it would be to be with you in person today, the thought of driving or flying from Western Michigan, where I'm located, through like the worst snowstorm of the season, it was making me really anxious. So I'm glad that this online format allows many more people to participate who would otherwise not have been able to be here, even all around the world. And lastly, I'm just grateful for you. I know that we're all really busy right now, and it takes a lot to set aside a whole morning for a symposium. So I just really appreciate your time and your attention, and I will do my best to make it worthwhile. First of all, a little bit about myself here. Again, my name's Robert. I'm a professor in the math department at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. We are a public university of about 21,000 students, are located halfway between Grand Rapids and Lake Michigan on the western side of the state. In addition to being a professor, I serve as a presidential fellow for the advancement of learning, and that's a quarter-time appointment in our president's office where I coordinate institutional and cross-institutional initiatives to innovate and improve teaching and learning. This includes the adoption of flipped learning wherever it can be done, as well as Shai mentioned, alternative grading practices, and especially right now, the rollout of active learning classrooms across our campuses. I have a pretty long history with flipped learning that goes all the way back to 2010, when I was teaching at another institution and stumbled across flipped learning while I was designing a new course. I'm not going to go into my origin story here, but just suffice to say that since then, I've made a lot of mistakes with flipped learning, and I've learned a lot while using flipped learning. And I wrote a book about this back in 2016. You can check out at my website, rtalbert.org/book. Now, since this is actually an interactive talk, and I'm using a platform called Mentimeter, and this allows you to watch the slides as well as leave questions, and there will be some opportunities to talk back to me using the platform. The slides will stay displayed on the Zoom screen if you just want to watch, But if you'd like to interact, and I hope that you do, just go open up another browser tab or grab your phone or your tablet and go to www.menti.com and enter in that code you see there, 81053415. And I am going to just put that information in the chat as well to save you a few clicks here. And what this will allow you to do is the slides will appear on that secondary browser tab you have set up there, a secondary display on your phone or whatever. And when the interactive elements pop up, you'll have the ability to respond there. And that website and the code are going to be at the top of every slide. So if you miss it now, you can pick it up in just a couple of minutes. Also, I have made a Google Doc for you all. I always believe in handouts. So I've made a Google Doc here that I'm also putting in the chat. There it is. That's a resource page for you. It gives my contact information, links to these slides, and links to a whole bunch of other stuff, blog posts and research that some of which I'll mention here in my talk today, and others of which you can just find fun and interesting and informative and useful to read. So just to make sure the tech is working here, I have a little poll for you to start with, and it asks just for your experience level with flipped learning. And on the menti.com screen that you opened up in your secondary place a minute ago, you should see an option to respond to the poll, and just click or tap on the answer that works for you and hit submit. And as that happens, as you can see on your Zoom screen or on the secondary slides, you'll see these poll results update in real time. So I'm going to give you just a minute to get set up with that. While you do that, two other housekeeping items just to get out of the way. First of all, the chat today on Zoom is for you to interact. I won't be actively monitoring that chat. That's for you. If you're having technical difficulties with Mentimeter or whatever, I encourage you to drop a question in the chat, because most of the time, honestly, other people answer those questions faster and better than I do. And secondly, there are two other icons in the lower right of the Menti screen. One of them that looks like two little text bubbles. If you click on that, it allows you to ask a question. And you can ask a question about anything you want at any time. And those will aggregate in a special slide that's at the very end of this talk. And maybe if we have some time, I can see on my secondary display here the questions as they come in. And I might, if we have some time or if something really good pops up, we'll take a second to answer it. And some of these slides, you'll also see a heart button, not on this one, but if you really, really love what you're seeing, you can click that heart button and it makes a little heart come up like on Instagram. So it looks like all of the plumbing is working here, and it looks like we have a lot of old hands at flipped learning, and a few newbies, and a few. I love the never tried it, but I'm curious. I am so glad you're here, and I hope this isn't too overwhelming, and I hope you get something out of what we're going to talk about now. So thanks for that, and let's go ahead and get it started. So when Shaya first emailed me about speaking today, it was not just 2021, it was post-Delta, pre-Omicron 2021. Okay, so it's funny how we're fitting all of the events of our lives into sort of like a liturgical calendar, you know, where we put ourselves into relative position with the virus. Cases and deaths at that time were on the decline. Vaccines and boosters were readily available for everybody. And so this event was planned to be in person, and it was going to be the first in-person talk I'd given since March 2020, right about 10 days before everything shut down. But then Omicron hit and the whole event was made virtual, and it turned out that was a pretty good idea after all. So thankfully, the data that I've seen from recent days seems to be indicating that while COVID is still a huge challenge, this Omicron surge might be receding. And in fact, I'm starting to see some very tentative headlines talking about the end game of the whole pandemic. What's being theorized is that we're moving from a pandemic, where you have the contagious disease that has a worldwide scale, to an endemic, where the disease is found in a community, it's present, but it's not necessarily manifesting itself. And when it does manifest, it's not as severe as it used to be. Chickenpox and malaria, for example, are endemic. Okay, so some endemic diseases like malaria are very, very serious and can be severe or life-threatening. But generally speaking, according to my friends who are evolutionary biologists, because I asked them when I was making this talk up, viral diseases that start as extremely potent pandemics can often follow natural selection into forms that are more transmissible but less deadly. Now, we don't know if COVID is such a virus yet. I personally hope that it is. And I'm not here to talk about COVID, actually. I'm here to talk about the general idea of things that begin as unusual but highly potent, and then over time evolve to become more common but less potent. So one day I was thinking about this idea after reading the news, and I got to wondering, do viral ideas ever follow the same trajectory? That is, when you have some novel, interesting idea that goes viral, it just comes out of nowhere and suddenly, you know, it seems to be everywhere. Does it move from something really unusual and potent to something that has a lot of widespread acceptance, but also less potency? Like, do viral ideas follow the same natural selection path that viral diseases do? So I'd like it to actually get your thoughts on this. So here's another interactive. I'd like you to think of any examples you can of this, where there was an idea or like a product, like something related to an idea or a service that started out rare and disruptive, but gradually became common, but less disruptive. Now on your menti.com screen, you should see a text box, and you can type anything you want that comes into mind in that text box and hit submit, and it will appear on your Menti screen. So what are some examples of viral ideas that started like a pandemic but ended up endemic? Okay, smartphones, right? Smartphones, I am just old enough to remember, I'm actually more than old enough to remember when smartphones came out. And it was like, wow, this is Star Trek stuff. And now everybody has them. Streaming music, virtual meetings. Yeah, I mean, I remember very clearly at Steelcase, someone put Zoom of their, we were using, at Steelcase, where I was a scholar in residence, we were using a WebEx, which is another piece of software for remote meetings. And it was terrible, it was buggy, constantly bad. And somebody there at Steelcase said, well, I've heard this new startup called Zoom or something like that. And I was like, what the heck is Zoom? And now it's funny because Zoom is like, it's a verb, it's a noun, it's like part of our language. Bitcoin investing, Post-it notes, and that's an interesting idea. I'm a big Post-it note fan. And when Post-it notes came out, it was kind of an interesting, almost disruptive technology. Now everybody uses it, and it doesn't make a lot of waves. I mean, when you see a Post-it note, you don't think, wow, that's disruptive innovation. Like, everybody uses Post-it notes, right? I'm going to go look up what the Jerusalem dance challenge actually is. I might be too old for that. I'm not totally sure. All right, so a lot of great examples, and you can just go through and find all kinds of ideas of products, services, memes, things that were hugely disruptive and very uncommon at first. And then as more and more people adopted it, it spread, but maybe had less of an impact. Okay. Now, I'm going to be real with you here. I am a little concerned that flipped learning is becoming like this. Okay, I'm becoming concerned that flipped learning is becoming one of these ideas that everybody is doing it, but it's having less of an impact than it used to, and less of an impact that it should. Present company accepted. I'm not saying, I'm just based on what I've heard today, I can see that. But as I go around to places and work with faculty and I read the articles, I can see that flipped learning has been oddly quiet for the last 5 to 6 years. Okay, before 5 or 6 years ago, you would see occasional news items about flipped classrooms, and it would cause this big stir, tons of comments, lots of retweets. Because it was a radical idea 5 or 6 years ago with radical success attached to it. Now, I have not seen one of those articles since around 2017. And I wonder sometimes why. I mean, did flipped learning go extinct? Well, it turns out that it didn't go extinct. It went endemic. I used to say that back in those days, 2017-ish, that we won't call it the flipped classroom after a certain point. We'll just call it the classroom, because everyone will be doing it. It'll be a normative practice, and we don't need to talk about the flipped classroom. It's just normal teaching. And I think we may well be in those times today. Flipped learning, as you can see today here, it's spread far and wide, and it's still going. But I sometimes wonder if it's losing some of the early potency that it used to have to enact change in students and in faculty and in higher education at large. If we're talking about COVID, then becoming common but mild is a great thing. But if we're talking about something that's positively disruptive, like flipped learning, becoming common and less potent would be a waste. And so my main point and my call for action for you today, I'm going to start right with the call for action, not at the end here, but at the beginning, is that we can take what we've learned here at the symposium and keep flipped learning viral, continuing to spread in every corner of higher education and K-12 education and beyond, without losing its positive disruptive potency. Now, I'd like to spend just the next 30 minutes or so exploring how we can make this happen. So first of all, I need to give you a brief history lesson from where we've been. I will keep this brief, but it's important to know where flipped learning actually came from. So flipped learning as an organized concept showed up in the Harvard physics classrooms of Eric Mazur. We've already heard about peer instruction this morning. Flipped learning, the first real instance of flipped learning as a distinct concept was actually in Eric's flipped learning, peer instruction classrooms in the 90s. Then nothing really happened with this idea until the early 2000s, and there was this burst of experimentation. Some economics professors at Miami University in Ohio invented something they called the inverted classroom. And then there was this lone computer science professor at Cedarville University, which is also in Ohio. And he was teaching a web page design class. This was 2000, so this is a brand new thing. And he was the first person to flip a class and call it a flipped classroom. That's the term classroom flipped goes to J. Wesley Baker at Cedarville University. And then shortly after that, Jeremy Strayer, who strangely was also in Ohio at Ohio State University, did his PhD thesis on flipped instruction. It was the first sort of research publication about flipped learning that was ever done. So back in the early 2000s, there were these rumblings that something disruptive was taking shape out there in higher education. It was called flipped something or other, inverted, right? But flipped instruction didn't go truly viral until John Bergman and Aaron Sams wrote this book called Flip Your Classroom. Almost 10 years later, it was in the 2010s. That book was aimed at K-12 instructors. And so these are folks that are mostly out of the loop of what higher ed people were doing. And John Bergman and I talk regularly. And I've asked him once before, did you know that these people in Ohio and Eric Mazur were doing this stuff with flipped instruction? Back in the 90s and the 2000s, he said he had no idea. So this was all completely isolated from each other. Aaron and John not only wrote this book, they started a hugely popular series of workshops. They were teaching in Colorado, and they started offering these workshops to K-12 instructors in Colorado. And it was like mobilizing an army of teachers who wanted to do flipping after they went to these workshops. It was the first outbreak, and the Bergman and Sams workshops were like the super spreader events of flipped learning back in those days. Now, in a pandemic, once outbreaks start to occur, you begin to see exponential growth. It's kind of hard to measure how common adoption of an instructional practice is, like flipped learning. I'm sometimes asked, like, well, how many people are using flipped learning today? So it's really kind of hard to tell, because some people do it on a spectrum. Some people do full flipping, partial flipping. But if you want a reasonable proxy for adoption of an instructional practice, you can look at the volume of publications about that instructional practice that take place in a given year. So this graph right here shows you the cumulative number of peer-reviewed published articles about flipped learning that are in existence in a given year, starting back in 2000 and up through 2020. Now, this is classic exponential growth. I collect these data. I started doing this for my book, and I just make a habit of it. Every June, I update the data for the previous year. And at the latest one was for, I did back in 2021, June, July. That link, by the way, is also in the resource page, so you can find it there. And I update this once a summer. And in that blog post, I actually did as a good mathematician would, I did an exponential regression model for the data that's up here. And the R squared on this is 0.9425. Okay, so that is nearly a perfect fit. So it's a highly reliable model. The model indicates that publications are growing at 31% per year. 31% per year. So that's a lot. I tried to translate this in a pandemic virus. It has a thing called an R0 value. And I tried to get that converted into an R0, and I couldn't find exactly the math. So maybe y'all can help me out with that. But this is like a highly infectious virus, if you want to think of it that way. Now, whether research on flipped learning infects other people, like you read a research article and it gets you to do it yourself, it's an open question, but I suspect there's something to that. Now, right around 2015, 2014, when the elbow of this exponential curve started happening, I started writing a book on flipped learning. And I had been blogging about flipped learning ever since around 2010, when I started using it in my classes, because I figured I need to just work my thoughts out. My book came out in 2016. It might have been 2017. I can't remember when, but I immediately started getting requests to come and do talks like this and workshops with faculty as soon as that book hit the press. I still think of those as the early days of flipped learning, like we might think of COVID before the Delta surge, like before it really took off. I noticed 4 very important things about flipped learning then. Number one, almost nobody was doing it. It was a very strange and unusual idea. Most faculty had never even heard of the concept of flipped learning, and there was definitely not a market for it, as we would say in higher education. And yet the second thing I noticed was that there was a huge hunger for what flipped learning had to offer. More active learning, less time in the classroom lecturing, more personal engagement with students. Flipped learning at that time spoke to a need and a desire that faculty themselves didn't even really know that they had until they heard what flipped learning was about. It really struck a nerve early, and it tapped into this huge groundswell of interest. Which leads to the third thing that I noticed back in those days, which was just how quickly flipped learning will take off with faculty once they hear about it. It really was a viral idea. Those workshops were the super spreader events. So faculty would show up, they would quote unquote catch flipped learning, and then go around and infect their colleagues with it. Again, if this is COVID we're talking about, then that's terrible. But if it's a good idea, like flipped learning, that's like the best of all possible worlds. And that's the fourth thing. Okay, flipped learning, when it was first introduced, was enormously disruptive. And I mean that in a good way. So if you go back and read some of those early papers around 2015 to 2017, you see a lot of great things happening. Flipped learning improved student engagement and performance, including attendance. More learning happened. Faculty were happier. Students were often happier after a while once they got used to it. It really upended the entire way that college instruction worked in a way that was frankly sorely needed at the time and still is now. In other words, the flipped learning pandemic, if you will, was on. Flipped learning was not incredibly common, but it was spreading, and it was hugely potent and causing major disruption in a way that higher education really badly needed. Now let's get ourselves up to the present day. Okay, that describes the last half of the 2010s. Let's move up to 2020. I remember March 2020 very, very well. I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is a picture there on the right, working with the engineering faculty at the University of Sao Paulo. And they had flown me down to Brazil specifically because they wanted to completely gut and remodel their engineering curriculum to center it on flipped learning and active learning for a variety of reasons. So I spent a week with them. I arrived back home in Grand Rapids on Saturday, March the 7th, and on Tuesday, March the 10th, we got an all-campus email saying that GVSU was closing down for the duration of the semester, and all classes were going online starting on Monday. I was department chair at the time, okay? And on Monday, March 16th, we flipped the switch on what I've come to call the big pivot. The big pivot is where we moved everything to online, ready or not. I was the chair of the math department at the time, like I said, and I was responsible for shepherding over 1,000 students in about 100 different math courses, and the faculty who teach those math courses into online versions of those courses, which were never designed to be taught online. Now, I noticed a couple of things in that situation as well. First, I noticed that while all the faculty were stressed out by the disruption of the big pivot, the faculty who were teaching their courses with flipped learning, of which there were several in our department, had a much easier time with it than those who did not use flipped learning. In fact, many of the latter group, who I consider like gifted and accomplished instructors, really struggled with this pivot. And in fact, not just struggling, they were close to breaking down. The second thing I noticed was as soon as the big pivot happened, I started getting a sudden influx of requests to come out and give talks, or not come out, but sign on to a Zoom meeting somewhere to give talks and workshops, as well as a whole bunch of one-off questions out of nowhere from people I've never known about flipped learning. And up until that point, I think I mentioned earlier, aside from this thing I did in Brazil, I had not gotten a single request for a talk or a workshop on flipped learning in over a year. I just figured, flipped learning had run its course. It was kind of extinct now. But then I got 6 requests in March alone. I was really confused about this. I thought, I would expect to see a big bump in interest about online teaching or teaching with technology, which are some other topics I tend to write about. But flipped learning, I mean, who cares about flipped learning? I mean, we have all this big surge happening, this big pivot. Don't you care about something else, was my question. And I began to wonder, do these faculty, do these administrators who are inviting me out know something I don't? So I want you to think about that. Here's another interactive for you. Why would the onset of COVID-19 and the big pivot unlock a sudden interest in flipped learning? Speculate for me on this for a minute. On your Menti screen, you have another text box. Why do you think there would be a sudden interest in flipped learning after the big pivot when COVID hit? I'm curious to know what you think. I have some answers too, but I want to hear yours first. Okay, there's engagement for students. When done well, right? Engagement. Yeah, everything else is blown up. Why don't we just go ahead and keep blowing things up? Flexibility, okay, in terms of student learning. What else do you think? Right, I like this one here, a change in mindset about how precious time with students truly is. Someone in one of their earlier talks mentioned something about, students were back in the classroom. They were so energized just to be around each other. I don't think we'll ever take physical presence with another human being for granted again. COVID has made us better professors. I think that's really true. We have a lot of things, a lot of ideas here. Flipped learning perceived as video lectures, so going online was associated with virtual learning. There's a kind of a concordance of modalities taking place here. Faculty didn't know what to do. Might as well, that goes back to the, you need to change everything anyways. So why not, we're already sticking our necks out there. Let's just go ahead and stretch a little bit more. Greater interaction. Okay, that kind of fits with good engagement for students, I think. Students can learn when they are able to. That's maybe an important idea. Okay, I'll give you like 10 seconds to give any other ideas you want to go in. I'm liking what you're thinking though, and I think that we're along the same lines here. Yeah, so all of what you said is true, and I had been thinking in February 2020, that flipped learning was maybe becoming extinct as an idea, like a virus that had sort of run its course, like the Zika virus. I mean, nobody remembers the Zika virus, but that was going to be the next big pandemic, and then it just sort of died off. And nobody's really ever heard of it since then. It starts off exponential, gradually as it spread. Eventually, everyone who was ever going to catch it had caught it, right? I've kind of maybe started wondering, like, every faculty member who is ever going to use flipped learning has already started doing it, and so there's no more interest. So like herd immunity, like higher ed had acquired herd immunity to flipped learning. But as I asked that question to other people, I found out 3 things myself, and maybe you'll see some familiar faces in these. So 3 possible reasons for this. One thing that's I think is true is that continuous exposition, which is a polite way of saying straight lecture, like teaching a class with only lecture. The shift to online instruction revealed this to be the ineffective method that it truly is. Okay, so straight lecture has never been, not since around 1980, when computers became common, has never been a truly viable method of instruction if that's the only thing you use. Lecture has its place, it's a tool, but as a single note that you hit as an instructor, it's not going to work. But now when classes are done on Zoom, it becomes obviously non-viable. And students knew this. Students knew. I clearly remember, I've got 3 kids, all teenagers, and I remember my 16-year-old, who was 14 at the time, waking up to do her first period math class on Zoom. Okay, so check it out. It's Michigan in March, okay, which means it's pitch black outside at 7:30 a.m. when you're supposed to sign on to a Zoom meeting when it's freezing cold and there's a foot of snow on the ground on a lecture about algebra. Now, she came to me one morning because I was in my home office and just down the hall, and she said, "Dad, I don't see, why are we even having the Zoom meeting? Why don't they just record the lecture and put it on YouTube?" And I said, "I know, right? I made a whole career out of this. You can totally do this." Students have never liked straight lecture, despite what they say. Okay. And in March 2020, they all started waking up, and we began to discover, we in higher education, that if all you have to offer in your class is a talking head on a Zoom screen, then students will pull up stakes and go find somewhere else to learn. It's all about engagement, or a big part of it is about engagement. Second thing that I noticed or heard was that something that a few of you mentioned, we realized in this big pivot that we can no longer assume that we have the ability to co-locate. So over hundreds of years, higher education has tightly coupled teaching with physical space. But as of March 2020, that just went completely out the window. Whatever instruction we use, it has to be something that is decoupled from physical classrooms, or can be decoupled from physical classrooms. We even see that today in this symposium. You know, the best laid plans to have the symposium in Edwardsville, Illinois, were scuttled not just by COVID, but by weather too. And if it's not a pandemic or a snowstorm, it's just going to be something else. So we can no longer really make plans for instruction to take place in a fixed time and space. Huge disruption. And instead, and thirdly, what has to take the place of a passive lecture done in a room that you have to get up and go to is more active learning that involves students in their own construction of understanding that can and does take place in any environment and any modality. Flipped learning fits all of those needs. When the pandemic hit, these faculty and administrators somehow remembered flipped learning from dimly in the past and pulled it off the shelf where it had been sitting and realized that it's the perfect fit. And I think that explains the spring surge that I saw, and maybe it explains this whole symposium too. So again, flipped learning didn't go extinct. It had gone underground and it had gone endemic. So today, there's both an opportunity and a danger in knowing this. Okay, the opportunity is that flipped learning, being endemic as it is not the wild and crazy idea that it used to be. The basic premise of flipped learning is pretty familiar to every college faculty member, every higher ed faculty member, and it makes a ton of sense in the context of an ongoing pandemic. And in fact, I'd say that, 2+ years into this situation, almost everybody out there uses flipped learning in some form, although they may not call it that by name. But as in all endemics, I also feel, as I look around at different implementations of flipped learning, that while more and more people are using it, it's in danger of losing some of that positive disruptive potency. Like chicken pox, it's everywhere, and yet it's nowhere at the same time. Now, how can this happen? I think there are 3 ways that a loss of potency can happen in my experience when it comes to flipped learning. See if any of these sound familiar to you. First of all, we can lose the focus on flipped learning that places active learning at the center of everything, active learning everywhere. Flipped learning can sort of devolve into nothing more than a choice about where the lectures should go. When your class becomes all about lectures and that drives the bus on everything, and the only question is whether students should sit through them before the class time or during the class time, then you might have lost the plot about flipped learning. Secondly, administrators can get involved. Administrators can get involved, right? Now, I work with our amazing president, Philomena Mantella at GVSU, and her cabinet, and I mean, no disrespect here, but we all know what happens, okay? When some big idea gets inside the head of a dean or a provost, you know what's going to happen next, okay? They will push a change down onto you and the students that ought to be coming upwards from faculty. And in fact, it ought to be coming from the students themselves. And it becomes the flavor of the month, like so many other failed ideas in higher education before it. And then thirdly, lest we make administrators the bad people here, we've got a responsibility too. Faculty can lose their nerve. Now, let's face it, you can't do flipped learning well if you don't on some level enjoy taking risks, okay? If you are risk averse, then flipped learning may not be for you. Okay, so everywhere I go and give a talk or a workshop, people give me these what if questions. I even heard a few kind of filtering in as I joined the meeting today. What if students don't do the pre-class work? What if I get bad course evaluations? What if, and so on. Now, when I get those questions in talks or workshops or from just people asking about it, I do give helpful, practical suggestions when I get these questions. But anymore these days, I have to say also, you know what? All that stuff might happen. I mean, you cannot make students do the pre-class work. You cannot make them like it, okay? Your entire class might show up one day without doing the pre-class work and expect you to reteach the material. And they might go en masse to the dean's office every day after class, as they did when I was first using flipped learning, to complain that you're not teaching the material. All of this and worse may happen. Flipped learning is not a safe pedagogical choice, okay? The only way to make it safe is to tone it down and to lower your expectations. You go ahead and reteach the material when students don't do the pre-class work. You drop back into lecturing during class time when there are complaints that you're not teaching the material. If you do this, it will make flipped learning a lot more palatable and it will spread faster because there is less to dislike. But when that happens, it is losing its potency as it spreads. So just to kind of move towards the end here, I want to urge you not to let this happen, first of all. And I want to give you 3 ways to keep it from happening in your own instruction. So take what you've learned today and glue it on to some of these injunctions that I'm about to give you here. So first thing we can do to make sure that flipped learning stays viral but doesn't lose its potency is to double down on active learning. The entire point of flipped learning is to inject as much active learning as possible into as many different places as possible in your students' learning environments. It is not about where you put your lectures. It is about putting lectures and all other non-active pedagogies in the right place, which might be no place. And we know that active learning is best for students on all the metrics that matter. We have research that shows this, but we do not need the research to tell us this, okay? So we adopt flipped learning because we are interested in getting as much active learning as humanly possible into our students' experiences as soon as possible. And we want to optimize and maximize the active learning that does take place. Let me assure you, you do not need to ask for permission or forgiveness to replace lecture with active learning. But if anybody does ask you for a justification, here's something you can do that's fun. Pull out your own institution's mission statement or strategic plan. This works especially well with administrators, by the way. I can guarantee you that somewhere in that documentation for your institution is a claim that the institution is quote unquote student-centered. Am I right? It's got to be in there somewhere because it's like a law. Okay, so you pull out your docs and you point to that statement and ask, are we really serious about being student-centered? If so, where is it in our pedagogy? Can we really claim to be serious about student-centered instruction when 80% of our classes are taught using a straight lecture format? And if we're not serious about it, let's at least be honest about it and replace that stuff about student-centeredness with something like, we're student-centered until it becomes risky. Number 2, embrace teaching yourself the material. Embrace the concept. Karen Huxtable just put this comment in the chat. It's like the I had to teach myself comment. Embrace the concept of having students teach themselves the material. Lean into it. I know what you're thinking. This is probably the most common chestnut on those negative course evaluations that you get with flipped learning. You know the ones that are in all caps, one giant paragraph. Okay, we all get them. We have to teach ourselves the material in this class, or I wish you would just teach the material. People say this like it's a bad thing, but it's the whole point of college, to have the skill and the taste for teaching yourself things, that is the entire point of higher education. It's why it's called higher education. It's education about education itself. Teaching yourself the material is not a bug of flipped learning. It is a feature of flipped learning, and we have to lean into it if it's going to be effective as it can be. Tell your students you are leaning into it. Tell them why you are leaning into it. Tell them why a flipped environment is a safe space to build muscle on self-teaching. And then you give them your utmost support as they engage with it. If you still get pushback on this, and you probably will, go back to that college mission statement or strategic plan. And I can also guarantee you there's going to be something on there about how much your college values lifelong learning. Point to lifelong learning and ask, are we really serious about lifelong learning? If so, where is it in our pedagogy? Where and exactly how are we teaching students to become lifelong learners? Or do we just expect this to happen? Should it instead say, we value lifelong learning, but good luck figuring it out? Thirdly, and lastly here, remember that the big pivot here is not going away. Higher education throughout the whole pandemic has been given a strong dose of real life. And because so much of higher education has spent the last 1,000 years hermetically sealed away from real life, it's really struggled to figure out how to adapt. What higher ed needs right now is a pedagogical model that fits real life better than the old ones do. And I really believe that flipped learning is that model. We center on active learning in all times and places, and in such a way that if you're in person, great. And if you're all not in person, then also great. Flipped learning in many ways is pivot proof. Okay, you can do flipped learning in an online synchronous class, an online asynchronous class, an in-person class, a hybrid class, a high flex class. You've heard it all this morning, and you've heard that it can be done and done well. And that makes it an extremely valuable and useful construct in this particular moment in history. I think that's why my math faculty colleagues that I told you about a little earlier when I was department chair and we did the big pivot, my math colleagues who were doing flipped learning it was stressful, but it wasn't like a complete paradigm shift for them. When we pivoted, they found that flipped learning fits the demands of the times really, really well. So viewing flipped learning as sort of the pedagogy of real life and a pivot-proof model for teaching helps you. And I just want to also add, it also speaks the language of those administrators that I've mentioned before, because here's an opportunity for them to deal effectively with the challenges of not just a big pivot, but the real challenge is all these small back and forth pivots that we're going to have to be making in the months to come. I mean, again, just look at this symposium and how we've had to pivot yet. It's not going away. And hopefully neither is flipped learning. So again, my call to action to you here is to not let flipped learning become endemic in a bad way, where it's common, but sort of impotent. Okay, keep spreading it through these suggestions I've given you here and all the positive energy you bring out of this symposium, but don't lose your nerve and don't lose your innovative, disruptive spirit. We need that now more than ever. We need to keep flipped learning potent, and unlike COVID, which we all just sort of wish would go away now, let's not, it'll become, if we could kind of keep it potent, the flipped learning will become not just the flipped classroom, but just the classroom. That's a normative model for all pedagogy in higher ed, and a continued positive, potent force for all of our students, past, present, and future. So that's the end of my talk. I'm going to take some questions now. I have one question over here in my screen here. I'm just going to flash it on your screen. Do you, asked on when I mentioned embrace teaching yourself the material, do you think that instructors misimplementing flipped learning is contributing to reduced potency as well? I would say, yeah, definitely that would be the case. There are a lot of ways to teach poorly with flipped learning. It's an easy thing to get wrong, just like active learning is in general. I find this, I have to think back to one particular instance. This was years ago. I was speaking in a panel session with another faculty member from a large and distinguished R1 university who was supposedly doing flipped learning. And this person said, yes, I do flipped learning. I record all my lectures and put them on YouTube so that when my students come to class, we can do even more lectures.
Oh my God.
Like that is not how it's supposed to work. I want to be able to lecture twice as much. And so I'll put some of them online, half of them online and the other half in person. And that is as my 16-year-old says, that ain't it. That is not how that's supposed to work. And so, but if you're a student, it's like, well, what's not to like? It's just like more sitting back and checking my phone and taking notes. So it's so palatable that it's easy to spread, right? So I think that, yeah, that's, keep implementing flipped learning through any means whatsoever, like failing, like I mentioned here, failing to really center on active learning and lean into the ideas that are uncomfortable for students, like teaching yourself the material, right? Students are not comfortable with this, but they had better get comfortable with it, because that is the #1 transferable job skill today. I mean, is the ability to walk into a job and learn on the go, learn anything at any time without a bunch of hand holding. That's what employers want. And you can explain it to them that way too. But if you get away from that, just I kind of don't like conflict and I don't want to really deal with the pushback, then yeah, I mean, you'll get more people interested in flipped learning, but is it really flipped learning anymore? So long answer to a very simple question. I hope that was good.
I think the end of what you just said is, as far as a job skill is, and asking questions.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. I mean, that's part of how you teach yourself things, is to have the self-regulation skills to know when you need to know more, and then know when you need to know more, and then have the initiative to go ask about it. And so we all know this. I mean, we all know that expert learners do this, and we all know that it's, a hugely important skill to have, and employers are not interested in having new hires who have to be lectured on everything. But where do we get students to practice it? That's my thing about point to the thing in your university docs that talks about lifelong learning and say, well, if we're really serious about this, we should be teaching students how to do it, right? It's not like gym class where they just drop a rope from the ceiling and say, oh, go climb that rope. It's like, well, I don't know how to climb a rope. How am I supposed to do this? At some point, there has to be instruction on to bootstrap yourself into becoming a lifelong learner. And flipped learning is the right place to do it. That's the end of the questions on the slide. I'm going to pop up the participant list to see if there's any raised hands or whatever.
Yeah. Anna asked, any advice for copyright related issues?
Anna, could you expand on that a little bit in the chat, or you can speak out loud, I think, if you want. I'm not sure exactly what that's referring to.
Where are you, Anna? Are you unmuted?
When you place materials online. So my advice would be, if you're making your own materials, you put what's called a Creative Commons license on it, which is if you're unfamiliar with Creative Commons licensing, it's a license like a copyright, but it's more permissive than a copyright. You can, for example, put a Creative Commons license on a piece of work that will allow a person to freely use it as long as they give you attribution for it, or they can freely use it without attribution as long as you don't use it to make money. There's creativecommons.org would be a great place to put that. However, materials from others, yeah, I'm not a copyright expert, but many times copyrighted materials can be reshared under a fair use agreement. So educational uses of copyrighted materials often fall under that. What I would really suggest to Anna and anybody else this question too, the right person to talk to is your library staff. The librarians at your institution know everything about copyright. And so hit them up and they will be able to give you any level of definition you want on an answer to that question. But I bet they'll probably come back to fair use, is my guess.
And
but the librarians are awesome. More people should be talking to them.
Universities might have their own policies in addition to that, and they would know that too. So they're
correct. The librarians will know all that stuff as well.
Up on everything.
Yeah,
someone pointed this out to me
once. I'm sorry, when someone had pointed this out to me once before, that if you do flip learning, start talking to your librarians because they will be able to give you materials and point you in the right direction. And they're a highly underutilized resource at most universities.
Go ahead, Ben.
It doesn't, thank you. It doesn't tend to be a problem because your material is generally on an internal, closed class, like Brightspace, Blackboard, Canvas, what have you. So even if there is copyright violation, I mean, it's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it fall, does it make a sound? I just don't think it really ends up practically mattering with that between that and fair use. That's my opinion.
We do want to model good practice though, I guess. And if we're going to teach students about, attribution and that kind of thing, we want to do it ourselves. But I see your point. I've slipped up before and stuck copyrighted images into slide decks and things like that. And 90% of the time it goes unnoticed. The other 10% of the time, it's pretty aggressive.
Well, I think it's good to attribute whenever you put anything on the slide. But I'm just saying, about like having to worry about using it in the first place.
Here's another question that popped up in the, it's in the chat and it's also in the slides here. And the question is, isn't mediocre flipped way better than straight lectures? It's at the risk of incurring the wrath of a whole bunch of people who are heavily invested in flipped learning. I'm going to say, I don't know. That's a hypothesis. And that if you do a mediocre flip, like how might you define that? Like a flipped learning that's done with like intentionally poor materials that are used in class for some reason. I don't know how that would even look. Do students learn better than straight lectures? It's possible, but so if you have to make a step in the right direction, I think trying to do what you can with what you've got with flipped learning and being committed to iterating over time and improving with practice, that's probably the right way to go. So I in the spirit of the question, I would say probably yes. There's a lot of, as a researcher, I'm thinking like, what are the variables involved? Like better, how do we mean better? More engagement, more learning, what's going on there? Probably the answer is yes on most metrics. What I would encourage you to do, again, in the spirit of that question, is to commit to being a learner yourself. As you go through, take notes on what you're doing, share with, you have a huge community of practice here. You're all looking at each other on this Zoom screen, connect with each other and share what you're doing, share what's working, what isn't working. And even if it's mediocre, it's on the upward trajectory. And I think that's pretty important as well.
I think one of the other things that I've been hearing from colleagues is future proofing your courses, and that we can put flipped learning in that category as well. And like you said, your colleagues in math, didn't have as big a disruption when in the March 2020 big pivot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the instructors who were like excellent lecturers who would also use a lot of active learning in their lectures, but not flipped learning. I was getting notes from them saying like, I'm not sure I can hold on much longer. I mean, that was like a literal text of a note. I was like, I thought I was going to have to, like, I don't know what was going to happen next. I mean, it was, many of them said it was like having to start totally over in my teaching profession from at zero. Whereas the flipped learning people were just like, yeah, okay, I've got to figure out how to do the Zoom breakout rooms and all that. But it's pretty much the same thing as what I've been doing. Otherwise, it's like that. That's a hard problem, getting good engagement, especially, now we have like a mixed, some people are in person and some people are still online. It's high flex, whether we want it or not. And getting that kind of mix is hard, but it's not like a novel problem for flipped learning people.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We still have a few minutes. Do we have more questions? Everyone's saying thank you very much for an excellent presentation in the chat.
While you're thinking of questions, I just want to throw this up there too. We did that already. And just to mention, thank you for your attention and your interaction here. The resource page there is at that website. I also dropped it in the chat a little earlier. I'll drop it again just in case you need it again. And it's got some stuff that I mentioned in the talk and some stuff that I didn't mention in the talk that's good to read. My book's at rtalbot.org/book. It's coming on almost over 5 years old now, and it's badly in need of an update, but it's still out there. And if you have any interest in connecting, please do. You can hit me up in a number of different ways. But yeah, we do have, I think, a few more minutes. I'll keep going until Patricia or Chaya cut me off.
Tom Manella had a question. Tom, did you want to ask it? Or do you want me to
Sure.
read it?
Thanks.
Go
No, that's fine. Hey, Robert, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I was wondering, so as I asked in the Mentimeter, some of the problem here is the variability in instructor preparedness for delivering flipped. And the comment that I made in the comment box was, in that way, we diverge from your metaphor a little bit. All viruses are genetically identical. All flipped instructors are quite different. So it's almost like each of us is a variant of the pandemic working in our own silos, right? Some of us with higher efficacy and some with lower. What do you think, from your kind of perch in all this, we could do as a community of flipped learning instructors to police ourselves, to police each other, and to kind of standardize the student learning experience? That would, optimistically bring back some of the potency, but what strategies are there to raise the bar, so to speak, so that the student experience with flipped learning is increased for all? Thanks so
That
much.
is an outstanding question. I'm really grateful for that question. I think that you're doing it right now by connecting up with a community of practice of people that you have met before. And if you want to know more about what people are doing, you're learning about it right now. I don't know if a standardized approach is like ever going to happen, because like you said, we're all very different. We get into higher education because we're sort of free spirits in some ways and creative types. And so what we want to see, but what I find in my department, it's a very active department. We share ideas all the time. It's like, I'll think of doing something and I'll go over to David Clark's office and pick his brain about it. And eventually over time, even though I feel like I'm a very different teacher than David is, we're kind of doing the same thing. I was making out a syllabus for my course I'm teaching now. And I went over to grab something out of David's syllabus because I steal from him constantly. And I grabbed something that looked really good. And I realized, oh, I wrote that. And he stole it from me like 2 years ago. And so after a while, maybe it is like a consistency that begins to take place. When you have a really strong and robust community of practice where you know people and you can rely on them and you feel safe asking questions around them, then you begin to start to sort of move toward an equilibrium point, not in terms of like being static or stagnant, but you're all kind of moving in the same direction, doing really good things with the personality that you bring to it and the heart that you bring to it, and the variation that your students' personality and heart bring to it. But you're all kind of understanding what you need to do, right? And that's important. So I would just say, wherever you are, find other people who are also working on flipped learning. A good way to do that is if you have a teaching and learning center on your campus, and you can ask them to maybe set up a faculty learning community for this, where you can meet with each other on a regular basis, do research with each other, share ideas, share failures, and that kind of thing. And there are other larger communities too. You heard a little earlier today from the Flipped Learning Global Initiative, I believe, and that's a large worldwide community of practice that's quite active and really useful. So that, to me, it's like the answer is community, I think, and anything you can do to build and engage with a community of other people who are doing this. I know that I would not be here if I didn't have a community of people that early on, 2010, 2011, when I was just stumbling around in the dark trying to figure this out, I finally started tapping into some people who knew what they were talking about. And that's where that was like what got me over the hump. And if there's anything good about what I do now, it's mostly because of them. That's a fantastic question, Thomas. Maybe the biggest question of all. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Ben, the final question, if it's quick.
It's not real.
Oh.
So I'm the one who said doesn't.
Benjamin, you're cutting in and
mediocre
out.
better than straight lecture. I was kind of. Oh shoot. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're breaking up.
Okay, so far so good.
I was the one who made the comment about the mediocre flipped. It was referring back to earlier in your when I started Flipped, I mean, I basically took some of my assignments. I put my lectures on video, and I started bringing the assignments to class and having them work on class. This was for epidemiology, for example, and a lot of problem sets and stuff like that. And I mean, the student learning immediately increased dramatically. And so I just think if we start saying, well, it has to be at a certain elevated level or don't do it, then all of the people who are even slightly risk averse are just going to say, okay, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And I think that does a disservice to the students. So that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's a well taken point there for sure. We're not gatekeepers here, right? We're just, you know, we want to do, and everybody starts off kind of at the same level. And if you're doing what you're describing, Benjamin, you're part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's like let's do that first, okay? And there will always be improvements to make, no matter who you are, how long you've been doing this, or where you are. So the important thing is to make the step like you did, and just again, be committed to gathering information from your students, from their learning assessments, from other people, and you know, identifying where you need to grow, and how you can grow, and then making a commitment to doing that. Okay, a lot of times we start off on a big, I used to be like this way. I mean, start off on some big idea, and, you know, students will like it at first because it's the Hawthorne effect. Like, students always like stuff that's new, whether it's, you know, oh, a new lecture. It's newness has its own sort of appeal to it. And then if somebody didn't like it, I would just get mad and stop doing it. It's like, there's a real narcissist about this stuff. But when you commit to a learning culture for yourself, then, you know, you have a trajectory that you can follow, and you know, it's good. It's a good model for your students, and it's just good practice as an instructor. So yeah, great points, Benjamin. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Robert. We thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. An excellent presentation.
Hey, thanks a lot for inviting me. It would have been nice to be there in Illinois, but again, I am sure glad I didn't have to drive through all this. So, or flying.
It's a snow day and the school is closed, but we are all at work enjoying this conversation, learning from each other. I'm blown away by these thought-provoking, inspired presentations throughout the day. In fact, I'm sure you all enjoyed the same too. The variety of topics that were thought-provoking was simply amazing. On behalf of my NSFIU's team and the entire planning committee, I want to thank all the speakers for sharing their ideas with us in today's symposium. Thanks to Dr. Talbot for his insightful presentation on the future of higher education and the role of flipped teaching. I will join you, Robert, at any capacity to make it viral and keep it alive and potent. It has been an honor to host all the members in the audience. I'm thankful to all the participants for taking the time to attend the symposium. Think about Dr. Elmarde from Al-Marifa University. It's midnight or past midnight, and they're all still here. So it just tells us how interesting this has been for everyone who is in the symposium. I am very thankful to the PALM Network for sponsoring the symposium. Thanks to my NSF team members, Drs. Lynn Bartels, Julie Fickus, Sharon Locke, and Georgia Bracey for being so supportive throughout the grant period. They have been the 4 pillars of flipped classroom in here at SIUE and St. Louis Community College. My symposium planning committee included Dr. Patricia Halpin and Paige Dickey. Their help in every step of the way in planning is greatly appreciated. Paige Dickey has been constantly keeping up with registration emails, presentations. Over the last 2 years, Paige has become my right hand, left hand, both hands. Thanks a lot, Paige. And thank you, Patricia, for handling it all so well. I'll also take this opportunity to thank the advisory board committee for guiding the grant project to proceed smoothly. Doctors Wayne Chen Hung and Jerry Overmeyer are in the audience. Thank you both. Overall, it has been a great day. Great job, everyone. Thank you very much. We will share the recording and slides soon to those that are interested. We have a survey to complete. Please take a few moments. It's not a long one. That would help us learn how the symposium went. Appreciate all your time here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, wait.
Cheyenne, Patty, thanks again for inviting me to come do this. Is there anything else you need from me right now?
Thank you very much.
thanks again. And then we will communicate through email.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds great.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again. All y'all have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye. If you have any questions, please stay and we can talk about it.
You may want to stop the recording.
That's right.